So welcome to this week's Optimal Health Clinic Facebook Live. This week I wanted to talk about managing relationships with friends and family when you have ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. This is, I think, one of the areas which is probably the source of the most frustration for people with this group of illnesses. Because if it isn't bad enough that you're suffering from all of the symptoms and your life is impacted in the way that it is, that at least normally if you have an illness of some sort, it's fairly immediately met with a level of sympathy and support and compassion and just general understanding from the people around us. And unfortunately, this often doesn't happen in ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia in the way that we would hope that it would. And so I think the first thing just to say is that is immensely challenging, difficult and frustrating. It's like not only are we dealing with this illness, but we're now dealing with all of the lack of understanding and the judgments and the criticisms from those people around us. So I think having some compassion towards ourselves, but also some compassion towards other people helps. But there are also certain strategies and certain tools that can help us with that as well. So I'm going to come to a few of those. I don't think this session, my kind of initial talk, will be as long as it's been on some of the previous Facebook Lives that we've done over previous weeks. So please do post questions underneath and I will then just go through questions. I'm somewhat expecting this to be a topic that's going to have a fair bit of discussion, and some of that might happen live on the video. And if that does, then I'm very happy to interact for a little bit now. But also I'll jump on the comments as I have done a little bit later on this evening and respond then as well. So beyond just kind of laying out that it is just an extremely difficult, frustrating situation, I think understanding why there's so much misunderstanding from people around us with ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, I think is helpful. And I think the essence of that is that it's an invisible illness. It's not like if you have something like, if you break your back, let's say, and, probably similar level of impairment that people can experience in a severe period of ME, chronic fibromyalgia, like you just basically almost can't move. But if you've got a broken back, they can somewhat see it, they can understand it, they can quantify it, and they get it. But not only do people see it and understand it, society gets it, the medical world gets it. Because there's this kind of invisible illness nature, like you can't see it, and at least in traditional medical investigation and tests, there's not much understanding of how to diagnose what's happening. In fact, what you have is a diagnosis of exclusion. And you don't have to go back that many years before the majority of GPs and medical experts had almost no understanding in terms of what was happening. At least in recent years, in this country, we've had progress in the NICE guidelines, the World Health Organization's got its act together, and at least what you have is that you have a general level of base understanding that's there, even if it's not the depth of understanding that we would want. So you're at least more likely to get a diagnosis. And yet what you have is a whole reaction of understanding that you might be sick, but not really knowing much more than that, and then a whole society response. And this was massively not helped in the 90s when we had this whole concept of yuppie flu. And so I still don't think we've moved that far from that period and from that time. So that being the case, the first thing we need to do is to simply educate people to what's actually happening. And that can be as simple as sending people links to things like the NICE guidelines, sending people a link to the World Health Organization, sending people videos, like things like that we produce here at the Optimal Health Clinic. We've been fairly prolific in terms of videos on YouTube, and more recently Facebook's been a place we've done things. There was a highly popular, and part of what actually triggered this idea in my mind, TED Talk, which has been doing the rounds, which perhaps if someone knows what I'm talking about, they can post it underneath, otherwise I'll do it later, which was a former Harvard PhD student who developed ME, chronic fatigue, and has also produced a film, which is currently, I think, doing the film circuits. But that certainly helped, and that's certainly something to send to people, to educate people in terms of the TED Talk. But I think understanding people's lack of understanding doesn't have to be the end point. Oh, my phone is falling over. People's lack of understanding means they need to be educated. And we've come a very long way in the last 10 to 15 years of understanding in society around mental health. And we have come some way with ME, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. We just haven't come as far as we need to come, or as far as hopefully we will come. Someone's just put, why don't doctors recognize ME and fibromyalgia? I think part of it is because it's a diagnosis of exclusion. There is not yet a biomarker, a test that you can do, which they can send off blood, they can look at it, and thank you, Emma, and hello, Emma, thank you for putting the TED Talk. That you can do a test and have a biomarker, they can have a piece of paper, and that in their world gives a legitimacy. And part of the reason why we haven't got a biomarker is there is no single pathogen which is the cause of what's happening consistently with people with ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. In fact, one of the things that we've been fairly strong about for, I guess, too many years now is the recognition and definition of subgroups and stages and the different systems that are affected. And until we recognize that, we can't recognize that we're dealing with a whole group of different illnesses. There isn't going to be a single biomarker, but that lack of a biomarker has a significant impact. Gemma's asking, how do you explain that it's psychological but not all in our head? Well, I think one of the things here to also understand is that all illnesses have almost all illnesses have a psychological element. And what I mean by that is even if you break your back, there is a psychological element. Not is that you had the kind of very unhelpful kind of societal perceptions of kind of psychological work, that you had a negative thought, so you broke your back. But the way you respond to the pain, the way you coach and support yourself through it, the way as the injury starts to improve, how do you then start to gradually manage that and work with that? There's a whole psychological element in the recovery of something like a broken back. And that's true in ME chronic fatigue. And maybe I'll do a separate video, maybe I'll do it next week, looking at the different places that psychology is important. We talk about psychology being important in terms of calming the nervous system, in terms of dealing with achiever patterns, in terms of dealing with coaching and supporting yourself. There's lots of different places psychology is important, but that doesn't make it a psychological illness. And one of the ways that I think is helpful to separate ME, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia from depression, for example, and by the way, depression is also an extremely legitimate, real experience that people have, but it's not the same experience as ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. And the difference, one of the differences between the two, is the general orientation of someone experiencing depression is they want to get into bed and hide under the covers and hide away from the world. Their inclination is to move away from the world because for whatever reason, it feels overwhelming. They have significantly low hormones or more biologically impacted, but they don't want to be in the world. The experience of the vast majority of people with ME, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia is they want to get out of bed and they want to come into the world. Like that is the energetic draw in terms of what's happening. So ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia being labelled as depression, it's not, depression is an absolutely valid real experience. This is not meant as disrespect to depression, people that are depressed or experiencing depression. But the misunderstanding is incredibly unhelpful because the misunderstanding leads to the wrong kind of support. So if someone's depressed, encouraging that person to get out of bed or to come into the world and to exercise and go and do things is shown to often be helpful. Now, it needs to be done with compassion and understanding and a certain delicacy, but it's helpful. For someone with ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, it's incredibly unhelpful. In fact, most people with that group of illnesses are already pushing themselves far too much. And so when helpful friends and family are trying to encourage them to do things, often what they're doing is they're causing more problems and putting more pressure on people. So firstly, to educate people. Secondly, to recognize in ourselves that the experience we're having is absolutely legitimate. Now, I know this sounds like a crazy thing, because when you're experiencing it, you have no choice, there's very little choice, to recognize what you're experiencing is real and true. And yet, there's this very odd thing that I've noticed that a lot of patients do, and I look back on the time that I was ill, and I think I was guilty of it as well, which is being in this strange place of trying to constantly convince ourselves that we don't have a chronic illness. Even though we're adapting in our life in all of these ways and we can't do all the things that we want to be able to do, it's like we fight that identity, and there's validity sometimes in fighting that identity, but we're also fighting the legitimacy of the experience we're having because we don't want that label. But by not taking the label and by denying it, when other people challenge what's happening, it's like we don't just stand up for ourselves and what's happening. It plays into this insecurity in ourselves in what's happening. It's like we're so desperate to have someone on the outside validate what's happening so we can validate it for ourselves that we don't fully just, when someone's being completely misunderstanding, just call it out for what it is. It's like it triggers something in us where we suddenly feel small, and the need to justify ourselves and apologize and explain ourselves. We're also a lot more emotionally vulnerable than we would normally be. And if we were our more healthy, resourceful self, we would be, excuse my language, fuck off, how dare you speak to me like that? You'll be absolutely ridiculous. I have a chronic illness. That's absolutely offensive and disgusting. You speak to me in that way. And we would have a kind of solidity in terms of how we communicate. Not that I'm necessarily encouraging, but that's a helpful way to get people on side. But we just wouldn't take the shit that we take, that when we've been ill for either a long time or it's really affected our lives and we feel delicate and we feel needy of people, we want to be understood, and we're also sometimes dependent upon people to help take care of us, that we almost become overly apologetic and kind of like trying to justify and trying to explain. And I'm not saying we should swing the other way, but I also think we need to own and be enforcing in ourselves, in our own kind of communication with ourselves, we have a severe chronic illness. One of the primary symptoms of that illness is fatigue and all the other things we experience. And that means we can't do all the things in our life we want to be able to do. And by the way, we are the one which is suffering the most. It's like we feel bad for the people around us that we're letting down. And I get that it can be extremely difficult to be caring for someone with a severe chronic illness. And I say this from some experience because one of our family members has had Lyme disease for several years, and they actually stayed with my wife and I for about 2.5 years in our house when we cared for them. So I get it. I've been, something I haven't really said publicly, but I've been on the carer end of the spectrum, and I get how difficult that is. By the way, they're doing much better now. But equally, we are impacting our lives in all these ways, and yet we're feeling this sense of delicacy around everyone else. And we should be sensitive to it, but we also shouldn't be afraid to stand up for our experience. But the way to stand up for our experience is not by being angry and being aggressive and being frustrated. As valid and as legitimate as that is, it isn't constructive. It isn't actually going to change the things we want to change. So one of the things I say is educating people. The second thing is helping people to understand the fluctuating nature of the illness. Because this is one of the other things which causes a huge amount of frustration for everyone concerned. That we say to people, please don't, keep overdoing it. So if you see me trying to do too much, please stop me and please warn me. You really want to enlist everyone's help in helping you not overdo it. And then you go for a period where things start to improve and you start to have more energy. And, with support of perhaps a practitioner, you realize it's now time to very gently, very carefully start to bounce the boundaries. And then everyone around you starts saying, oh my God, you're going to relapse. And everyone starts reinforcing all of the anxieties that you have. So by helping people understand that there is very much a fluctuating nature to what's happening, it means that they can recognize we're going to need different things at different points. Which leads to another point of one of the things that's very difficult caring for someone is seeing them suffer and not knowing what to do. And this is particularly true, I think, of men. I've got a lot of people press love at that point. I think it's particularly true of men, but I'm sure it's true of all people, just partly because it's more of a masculine instinct to want to fix things all of the time. Something that when I met my wife, I had to realize was incredibly irritating and unhelpful sometimes. But people want to be able to fix, and they want to be able to help, and they see you suffering, and they don't know what to do to help you. And often what they therefore try to do is they try to encourage you to do things, or they try to cheer you up when you just want to actually stay in contact with how you feel. So if you can give people very clear instructions to what actually would help you, what actually would support you, like for example, maybe you want to start vegetable juicing, and doing the shopping and getting all of the kind of ingredients and washing them and putting them through the juicer and then clearing up the juicer is something that if you do, it's the main thing you do that day. And then you're like, do I really want the main thing I do that day is to make a vegetable juice? And actually it would be hugely supporting that actually someone could do that for you. And they'd probably love to think they're actually doing something to help. So giving explicit, clear instructions that this is something that you could do and this is how it would support me, and obviously being grateful and appreciative when it's done, people really appreciate that. And Margaret's just said you have to explain to them what you can do and what you can't do. That's absolutely true, and you also have to explain as that changes as well. And actually, sorry, I'm jumping around a bit here, but that also, Margaret, reminds me of something else, which is the tendency to want to tell it better than it is. And we do that because we want everyone else to feel better about what's happening. We want to feel what's better about what's happening. Often by nature of the kind of person that gets ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, by definition, we tend to be someone that wants to see the world better than it is. That's how we manage to push ourselves. If burnout was a factor in getting sick, we've tended towards driving ourselves too hard. So we have, ironically, given this perception that people with ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia must just be kind of depressed and people that are lazy in their attitude to life, often it's the opposite. So we want to tell it better than it is. That is confusing to other people and it's often not helpful. Doesn't mean we need to dwell on everything that's bad about what's happening. But if we don't give people an honest sharing and assessment of where we are, it's then hard for them to engage to and respond to that. I will jump back through the questions a bit more in a second, and feel free to post more questions as we go. But I think just a couple of other things that I wanted to say about the value on the other side of having been through this experience. Because in some ways, going through something like this is almost the biggest test you can put on your friendships and on your relationships. And certainly for me, two things were very true on the other side. One was you really learn who your friends are. And I don't mean that in a kind of cruel, selfish, unkind way, because it is really hard for people around us to understand what's happening. But those that make the effort to really understand and really support us, and even though we can't perhaps come out and see them and connect and do things, they're thoughtful enough to send us a random text message just saying, I was thinking of you and how much I care about you and how much I can't wait to go and do things certain, we hugely appreciate that. And the second thing is, I certainly found on the other side of coming through the illness that I was somewhat bulletproof to other people's opinions about me. Doesn't mean that I became insensitive and uninterested in other people's opinions, but people's judgments that were just their shit being kind of lobbed at me, having been on the receiving end of that for so many years of being ill, and being at university and not being able to drink and party and all the judgments that you have, not being able to do those things, I just kind of learned to, again, excuse my language, but just not give a fuck if people had those opinions. And that has really helped. It's really served me in my life. If there's something that I'm passionate about and I care about, not needing lots of external validation from other people to feel legitimate in wanting to pursue it and wanting to do it. Caring about people that I care about what they think, but not being kind of weighed down by judgment and criticism. And so learning how to be less impacted by other people's stuff. It's not an easy thing to do when you're as vulnerable as you are when you're ill, but it is a very helpful quality, I would say, in life. So let me just jump back through some of the questions and comments on here. And I realised that was a slightly longer rant than I anticipated, but I'm probably a bit more fired up about this topic than I realised. So let's go back a bit. So Nicola's saying, I'm lucky that my husband is amazingly supportive. And yes, I think having a supportive, intimate partner is a massive help. And certainly what I've observed is relationships that have weathered the storm of a chronic illness like this are, it's obviously a great burden and challenge, but it's also relationships grow through challenge. And, the depth of potential for that relationship on the other side is very beautiful. Janice is asking, how do I respond each day after 20 years of illness when my mum rings me each day to ask if I feel better? That's a tough one. And it somewhat depends upon, Janice, how malleable your mum might be. But I don't know if it might be possible to simply say to her how that's, you appreciate she's asking because she wants you to feel better. She wants you to be suffering less, but actually explaining how that question makes you feel and telling her what she could do that's different. I think that's the thing. It's telling people what's not helpful, but it's then telling them what would be helpful. So what could she ask you each day? Or what could she do for you each day if she's capable of doing something, depending upon how old you are and she is and everything else. But yeah, where possible, trying to communicate that. Jenny is saying, I'm joining simply because of the freeze frames we get of Alex, which makes me nervous that my internet connection might not be what I thought it was. So thank you, Jenny. Sharon's saying, Emmy, fibromyalgia has completely changed my life. I'm not sure if that's for the better or for the worse. I guess it can be both, different experiences. Sarah's saying, especially hard for carers, parents of young children, the guilt and regret of not being able to be the parent you want to be. Any suggestions for those people? Yeah, that's a really good question. I think being a parent and missing out on those years and not being able to be how you want to be for them is incredibly difficult. And we've had a few sequence recovery stories over the years where we've covered that topic a little bit with people. I think one of the things where possible, building as much possible support as you can around the family system. So when you do have pockets of energy, that you can spend that energy on full-on contact and quality time with the children, as opposed to spending that energy having just to do practical day-to-day things. I think that helps. I think as children get a little bit older, helping them understand that it's what's going on and help understand it's not about them, and finding the ways that you can make contact with them and have time with them. I think that's really important. And also getting support just on the emotional impact, like just having good therapeutic support to just process how that feels, because it's difficult. And there's just, there are certain things that I can spin it in such a way to make it feel better. And there are certain things in life that just are difficult, and owning the difficulty and having support in processing that is definitely, I think, helpful. Just going back down this way on questions. Yeah, Michelle's saying it's hard when you see people shut down because they don't understand and think you look well, so don't understand how bad you feel, especially when you have a good day, so they don't get it. Many people have treated me like a fraud, which is hard. Yeah, I think that is really difficult, Michelle, and I think that's also where trying the best you can to the people that are willing to engage, to communicate that just because you look well doesn't necessarily mean that you are well. In fact, someone can look extremely well and feel absolutely terrible. And the same is also true of mental health. Someone could be suffering severe panic attacks and look completely normal to the world. And I think one of the things that I desperately hope will change in society is that people people talk more about these kinds of things. It's kind of extraordinary we live in a world where if things look good on the surface, if it looks good on the tin, that we assume all is good. I won't make any political comments about America at the moment, but the fact that someone says things we want to hear doesn't necessarily mean that it's all the way we want it to be. And, you know, it's, I think where possible, going back to what I said at the start, really trying to educate people is really helpful. Like, send them stuff, like the TED Talk, which thank you again, Emma, for posting the link to. Send them any of the stuff you want to from Optimal Health Clinic. There's quite a lot of different recovery stories now on the YouTube channel. There's videos like this, and hopefully they'll watch it. And if they don't watch it, and there's someone that's, you know, if it's someone that you're close to in your life, like, call them out on it. Say, you mean you couldn't spend 20 minutes watching a video to understand the illness that I'm spending my entire life at the moment surviving and dealing with? Like, I'm asking for 20 minutes. And I think if you just call it out a little bit, hopefully they might engage in that way. Yeah, Sharon's saying that she feels embarrassed of it. And I think that, again, is our own self-judgment. You know, we often have stuff with our own inner critic that we're constantly judging ourselves around it. Doing some work around that is a big liberation from that judgment. Because as much as we judge ourselves, that makes it extremely hard to get others to understand, because when we communicate, it's like we're doing it from a place that it's like we're questioning ourselves, and rather than just being very clear in our communication about what's happening. I'll take a few more. So Hazel's saying, I struggle with guilt when I'm sitting around not doing anything and everyone's doing everything for me. Luckily, my family and friends are brilliant, but I know they don't really understand what it's like. Yeah, they don't understand what it's like because obviously they're not experiencing it, but it's great that they want to help. A little clue, if there's a lot of guilt around that, like disproportionate guilt to the situation, look at achiever patterns and look at the tendency to judge your self-worth by what you do for everyone. Helper patterns by judging your self-worth by what you do for others, and achievement patterns judging your self-worth by what you do in the world. I think that's a clue to look at that, because that's probably what's driving the guilt there. Helen saying, sometimes I feel embarrassed and feel like I have to explain whys and wherefores in case people judge me, which they do. And Sam is saying, I keep apologising for it and feel like I'm a failure. Yeah, again, I'd really look at inner critic, I'd look at achiever patterns, I'd look at helper patterns. A lot of that material is causing a lot of extra pressure and stress in your system, and it's definitely not helping the whole process, and it's not helping this communication with other people. So the final one I'll take now from Helen. How can we explain right as rain, in their opinion, though we hide pain well, then another day we are flawed? I think that really comes down to explaining the nature of the illness. Also, if you are totally fine one day for a few days and then feel terrible, if you've got these big peaks and troughs, then I would really encourage you to look at things like pacing, because you shouldn't have big ups and downs in how you're feeling. To build a stable foundation for recovery, you need some solidity in your energy levels and a gradual progress around that. So booming and busting, apart from being unhelpful for other people to understand, is also something just to be addressed in terms of general recovery. Okay, final question, because I think one was coming from Louisa. I get nervous on my good days that people will think I'm better and then get disappointed when I have a bad day. Yeah, I think same point. If there are going to be good days and bad days, what we want to try and avoid is these big peaks and troughs in terms of what's happening. And yet, again, it really comes down to communication. And it comes down to people understanding that this, by definition, this is an illness that's fluctuating in nature. And when you have a good day, one of the other things that can happen is when you have a good day, you want to do more, because it's like, thank God, like I can do things, and people around you want to encourage you to do more, because they're coming from this idea that it's like depression, that if you just get out and do things, you'll feel better. And that is true at certain stages, but it's often not true at that stage I think we're describing here. And so what you want people around you is not this, you're having a good day, oh great, come and do stuff. You don't necessarily want them to constantly question you, but you want them to really let you listen to how you feel. And that's the support they can give you. Not everyone get carried away in the fact you're doing better to go and do too much, but equally not to, if you're doing better, to build lots of fear and anxiety, you're going to crash. You want to listen to what your body is actually telling you, and let your body be the guide of what you do, not your kind of pushing patterns or your anxiety patterns. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Susanna. I'm glad that's been helpful. That was a longer session than I anticipated, but yeah, it's great for me having the questions from you guys. And if you want to post any more questions and comments, I will jump on in 3 or 4 hours' time and respond a bit more. And also let me know what you'd like me to cover next week. I think I mentioned that next week I would do, one of the ideas that just came up as I was talking was something around the different ways that psychology can help. So that's one idea. Let me know if you'd like that, but also let me know other topics. I'm not always announce topics in advance, partly because Wednesday is the day that when I still see a handful of patients, I do them on a Wednesday. And what I've noticed is quite helpful is stuff comes out in the day that I'm working with people, and that sparks ideas, and then it's a helpful way. But I'm also happy to schedule some topics as well. So thank you, everyone. I'll talk with you next week. I imagine the week after we'll probably have a recovery story live, but thank you for watching for now.